We have had to face disease and look it right in the eye and embrace that uncertainty. And a lot of other people haven't. It's a new experience for most people. So I think cancer survivors have a lot to offer the world right now.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to COVID-19 Heroes. I'm your host, Lorraine Schneider, and today on the show, I have another guest who I have highly admired over the last few years. Jenny Novak serves as an Emergency Services Coordinator for the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services, where she helps local jurisdictions navigate through disasters. Jenny is also a new mom and a cancer survivor and shares how both life experiences are helping her weather this pandemic. Hi, Jenny. Thank you for being on today's show of COVID-19 Heroes. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, Lorraine. I'm really excited.
So, Jenny, what led you to begin a career in emergency management?
Well, I think like a lot of people, I didn't know what emergency management was in high school or in college. But what led me down the path to discovering it was I had to pick a research topic when I was a senior in undergrad at Humboldt State University. I was a geography student and I had to pick a subject to do original research on. So I decided to investigate earthquake and tsunami preparedness in Humboldt County because it seemed like a really good sort of intersection of human geography and physical geography. So I started researching that and I realized what a cool career field that would be to actually get to work with these types of hazards every day and to work with populations talking about this big what if scenario, something that could happen immediately and change the entire world. So I went off to grad school and studied disaster research there. And at that time, I also got an internship at the City of Los Angeles Emergency Management Department, where I was able to learn a little bit more about this actual field of emergency management and working for a government agency to try to coordinate resources and information in advance of these hazards and disasters that could occur. And I decided that was what I wanted to do. And that was the career path for me. So ever since then, I've really just been pursuing that and have held a few different jobs, but I've really enjoyed every step of the way up until now.
Yeah, I definitely share the same excitement and passion as you for this field. It's absolutely great. Just last week, you celebrated your 3-year anniversary working for the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services, Cal OES. What is your day-to-day job like at Cal OES outside of the pandemic?
So at Cal OES, I work for the regional office in Southern California. So California is a really big state. So our emergency management agency is really big as well. And we are divided into 3 regions that work with kind of as liaisons with local government primarily. So Southern California covers 11 counties, and that's a lot of people. I think it's I want to say 15 million, something like that, maybe more than that here in Southern California. And so what we do on a daily basis when there aren't disasters happening is that we build those relationships and we serve as kind of conduits of information back and forth between the county level and the greater state government. So our headquarters is in Sacramento, and that's where, probably 90% of the agency works in Sacramento. And then there's us field staff that work in the regions, and we're really kind of the face of the organization to people in the rest of the state outside of Sacramento. So, it's really a matter of attending planning meetings, attending exercises, just anything I can do to kind of coordinate with the counties that I've been assigned during my time. You mentioned I've been here 3 years now working with Cal OES. So I've worked with a couple of different counties during that time, Ventura County, Inyo County. I'm working some with LA County right now. I also work with colleges and universities because I came from a higher ed emergency management background. So I want to make sure that all of these kind of stakeholders in emergency management in Southern California are getting the information they need about any programs that are coming out of Cal OES. Cal OES also provides a lot of grant funding for the local governments, as well as any reimbursement funding when big disasters happen as well. So those relationships really need to be strong before any disasters happen. So that's what we're usually working on. But we also are technically in response because when a disaster happens, the region is already, boots on the ground in that particular area. So for instance, I was assigned to Ventura County during the Thomas Fire and the Woolsey Fire in 17 and 18. unfolding. And I was the one that got sent to the EOC, the Emergency Operations Center, during that incident as it was unfolding so that I could provide information back up to Sacramento about what was going on. And I could also provide them with any support that they needed. That's really our role as the state, is to come in and to provide some support to local government. If that's resources or personnel, anything that might exceed their local capabilities, the state is there to try to help with and provide. And then if anything exceeds the state's capabilities, then that's where we lean on our federal partners and the federal government and FEMA. So that's kind of a little bit about my role. So, we stand ready because we're a response for something like this pandemic to happen. And then we get to work when the disaster strikes.
For the first time in history, all 50 U.S. states and U.S. territories have a federal disaster declaration. Can you explain what a disaster declaration is, when they get invoked, and what your responsibility was when Southern California municipalities started proclaiming disasters?
I alluded to it a little bit already in terms of the reimbursement. When you're talking about a major presidential disaster declaration, which is what this is, so the president declared a major disaster. California, I think, was the second state to receive that. I think New York was first. And then now all 50 have that. And what that does when you get that major disaster declaration is that it opens up some avenues of reimbursement funding that can be available to local governments. So as you know, local governments have been working around the clock on this pandemic response, and they could really use some help paying for this. Already, some local governments are starting to look at their budgets and see what a large impact this has had. The city of LA just announced furloughs and hiring freezes the other night. So these local governments really turn toward the bigger levels of government to have some reimbursement. So that major presidential declaration will come down and help to backfill some of that. The local governments will get reimbursed 75% of their costs for what we call the emergency protective measures category. So that's really all the staff time and any actions that are taken to directly protect the public during that time. So this pandemic's a little bit different than other types of disasters because typically you have a lot of damages, you have debris removal and those kinds of things that also might need to be reimbursed or assisted with in other ways. But fortunately for this one, we're pretty much just looking at the overtime and other costs of setting things up, like the alternate care sites and field hospitals and testing sites and things like that. All of that falls into that category. So that's what the major presidential disaster does. And in order to get there, though, first the state has to ask for that. So first the state has to declare their own disaster and then ask the president to consider declaring a major disaster in the state. So that happened in California. And also all the other levels of government beneath the state can also declare. And that kind of prompts the state when that happens. When they start to see multiple counties that have declared or proclaimed is the correct verbiage for that, proclaimed a local emergency in their areas, then the governor will look at that and say, something's going on here. You know, this emergency exists that is outside of their capabilities to really deal with, and they're asking for assistance. So that is what happened with this. We had all 58 counties proclaim an emergency, which was, I think, unique. I don't think that has ever happened in state history. I'm not totally sure on that, but I can't imagine when it would have. Even a big earthquake would probably only affect half of the counties at a time. And then, of course, we had pretty much every city in the state also proclaiming an emergency because the cities want to make sure that they are checking all their boxes to also get some of the funds back for reimbursement and to alleviate any sort of restrictions that the city might have in place during normal times. So sometimes, you know, they have to go through a very strict and lengthy process for procuring things because it's public money and you want to make sure that it's not getting spent, you know, irresponsibly. But in an emergency, you kind of have to fast track some of those things. So a lot of cities are able to do that when they proclaim emergencies. So during that time when everybody was really getting on board with this and saying this is really a true emergency, I had just started a shift as duty officer for the southern region. So every time a city or a county would proclaim an emergency, I would get notified and we would get a copy of that resolution from their city council sent up. So my phone was just going off all the time because we were processing so many proclamations. It was really unheard of. I mean, normally on a duty officer shift, you might get one proclamation. If something big's going on, maybe you'll get 2 or 3, but not just, 20 a day like we were getting that week. It was really crazy. But yeah, this pandemic is unprecedented in so many ways. And I think that the scope of it and how many different entities it's impacting is really one of the most unique factors.
Now you're currently acting as the liaison between LA County and the state. What's that been like?
Yeah, so that has been my role for a month now. We have been processing resource requests. That's a really big part of my role because so many resources are scarce and hard to come by right now, like personal protective equipment. So things like gloves, things like N95 masks, Tyvek suits, hospital gowns, things like that are really hard to come by. And the state has actually put together what they call a MAC group, or multi-agency coordination group. And that group is looking at what they call scarce resources, which is mostly this protective equipment that nobody can get, and also hand sanitizer and Clorox wipes and things like that are really difficult to find anywhere. And they look at every request that comes in and try to prioritize and make sure that people get, at least part of their order fulfilled. It's really difficult and it's taking a long time in a lot of instances, but we're processing requests for that kind of thing. We're also processing requests for assistance with food distribution at local food banks. The food banks are seeing a ton of foot traffic, more than they've seen, in any time in recent memory. So we are helping with personnel for that. So we have like the California Conservation Corps, as well as the National Guard and some other volunteer groups that we work with that can come out to kind of staff some of these operations. The National Guard is also helping staff some of the testing sites that we have down here in LA County. All kinds of resources, really. Anything that the county might not have readily available is something that they ask us. And then my job is to make sure that Sacramento, our SOC, our State Operations Center, gets that information, and then that we can kind of close the loop on that, and that the supplies get down here, or that the personnel get down here. That's a big part, really, is the resources. And this is really just such a commodity focused operation. No other emergencies that I've been a part of have really had such a drain on resources. And, the number of missions that are in our WebEOC, which is the system we use to manage that, is just, there's so many. I think there's probably 30 or maybe even 40 in there for LA County right now, which is just crazy. Normally it's just a handful of them. So it's really been a big task for our disaster logistics. They've just been right in the middle of it, working with FEMA, trying to procure resources from private vendors, trying to get donations from private companies that might be donating things also, and then working that down the system. And they have to work with 58 different counties and make sure everybody's needs are getting met. And then LA County itself, on the other end of that, they are receiving requests from all of their city jurisdictions that are within the county and trying to work with them and to try to fill it locally as much as they can. But often those requests are coming to us at the state level. So we are really resource heavy. We're also sharing a lot of information. So the state produces a daily situation report, as well as the county produces one. So, I collect information from the county to share with our state partners, while I also provide a daily update to them about what are the big things that the state is doing. So that's really kind of been my main role in terms of the liaison. I'm also answering some recovery questions as we start moving toward that part of the operation, but that's pretty much the gist of it.
Yeah, definitely a prime time for being an emergency manager. So you also have quite a unique perspective because you work for a state organization, but at the same time, you're intimately connected with the local communities. What are some of the really positive things that you have seen on either side of that?
Well, I think, everybody is so dedicated. That's really one thing that comes to mind immediately, is just that this is really the long haul. I keep hearing people say this is a marathon, and it really is. I think LA County is on day 45 or something like that of their activation. And that's just, we never see it lasting that long. I thought 2 weeks was long when I was on the Thomas fire for 2 weeks. So people are coming every day and they're giving it their all, often for 12-hour shifts. And so I think that dedication is really unique and really impressive to this emergency. You're really seeing the people that are passionate about this coming out and, being essential workers. And, but on the flip side of that, I think the other thing I'm also impressed with is that a lot of people are innovating sort of as this is going, in that, it is not the safest thing to go to an EOC that is packed full of bodies right now, where people are just sitting right next to each other, as they often are. That's the point of having an emergency operations center, is kind of centralizing the operation and bringing people together so that they can talk about, resource prioritization and share information and try to avoid things getting, in silos by everyone being together. Well, in this disaster, it's not safe for everyone to be together. So one of the things that I think has been really interesting is seeing entities choosing to take their EOC virtual, which is something that is feasible. You just kind of have to have a system in place that works for your entity with that. And some do and some don't. And I think that that's one of the most interesting things that we're seeing now, is which entities are able to take all of their functions virtual. Some are doing kind of a hybrid approach where just a few people are in the room, which is good because then they can still maintain, 6 feet, and then having other functions virtual. But I think a lot of what we do in terms of information coordination and resource requests can be done virtually. And I think that it's really smart that a lot of operations are trying to move in that direction. And it's, in this day and age, we do have the tools available to do it. It's just a matter of, are you trained in it? Did you put in enough work ahead of time to make this a viable option for you now? Or can you, innovate really on the fly and make it work with phone calls or Zoom? Everybody's learning to use these new tools regularly, and it looks a lot different than your classic EOC activation. But I think it's a really important skill, because I think that we can take a lot of these lessons learned from using some of these virtual operations and apply them to other types of incidents, like an earthquake, for example, where everybody might not be able to drive to the EOC right away anyway, because the roads are going to be so damaged that if everybody could coordinate virtually in the beginning, assuming that communications were still up and running, it could be really useful for something like that. So those are some of the things that have really impressed me with some of the responses so far.
Speaking of earthquake, did you feel the one we had just a couple of nights ago?
I didn't feel that one, but I saw everyone talking about it.
Yeah, it was right around midnight, and I remember still being up and feeling it. And I thought back to the interview I did with Ed Colson just last week or 2 weeks ago, where we talked about what's going to happen if we do have another big disaster happening while all of this is going on. And yeah, thankfully it was just a little one.
We are having to think a little bit about that, though, right now, because especially with the heat coming this weekend and wildfire season approaching, a lot of our traditional approaches of setting up congregate shelters when people are evacuated from wildfires, they are not going to be advisable in this situation. So, and firefighting in general is a lot of close proximity people trying to get the fire under control. So a lot of people are trying to develop, new ways of doing that right now as well.
Yeah, I'm eager to see what kind of exercises and scenarios we're going to come up with over the next few years to really test out some more cascading events. Jenny, you are a new parent and a cancer survivor. Recently, you wrote a piece about how those two life experiences are helping you weather this pandemic. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So, I'm also a writer, and I try to write regularly on my website about topics of both disaster resilience, emergency management, and kind of personal resilience as well. From a perspective as a cancer survivor, I did recently write an article about, a lot of the feelings that are coming up in this incident are so familiar for survivors. One, the invisibility of the disease itself. It's something you can't see, and you don't know, well, do I have it, or am I touching something right now that might have it the virus on it. And you don't know even if it's already inside of you, which is a feeling that I think a lot of cancer survivors can relate to. And then that sort of anxiety of just the uncertainty of the whole situation and not knowing, what is life going to be like in a few months? Or, if I have it, I probably won't even find out for another week or so. It's a lot of really familiar feelings. And then also like the susceptibility of it, being the one that might be more susceptible than others. It's a scary feeling. And I think a lot of that is really being brought up right now. But I think that also as cancer survivors, we have a lot of tools in our toolkit that can be used right now and shared with other people, such as endurance. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, this being kind of that long-term event, cancer survivors are used to having to go through rounds of testing, rounds of treatment, and just, sticking through some really difficult situations. So I think that that's something that really lends itself now. One thing that's always worked for me is kind of celebrating the small milestones. So, anything that you can do right now, I know there's a lot of things we can't do, but we try to focus on what you can do. You can still go for a walk outside. If you have a yard or a patio, you can still sit out there. And things like the air quality and traffic being non-existent right now in Southern California. I mean, these are things that we can look at the positive and think about, without commuting, maybe we have time to do reading or yoga or something that you always wanted to do, but you didn't really have the time to do. And I also think that it's also a good time for cancer survivors to really connect with other people, because we have been through some really difficult things like this before, and we have had to face disease and look at, right in the eye and embrace that uncertainty. And a lot of other people haven't. It's a new experience for most people. And so I think cancer survivors have a lot to offer the world right now. And then in terms of being a new parent, yes, I just had a baby last summer, Scarlett. She's about to be 9 months old next week. So that's also been a little bit of a challenge because I am doing my coordination remotely right now. So I'm mostly working from home, which is good because her daycare is closed down because of COVID-19. So I'm in the same boat as a lot of other parents, having to juggle working remotely with also entertaining and trying to educate a child as much as I can. So it's been a challenge, but I'm actually really thankful for the extra time with her because I had just come back from maternity leave in February. So, I was kind of missing that. And then this happened. And now it's like this crazy, weird, like epilogue to maternity leave. But at least on the plus side, since I'm breastfeeding her, I don't have to worry about pumping or anything like that. Now I can breastfeed her at home, which has been really convenient. And I was able to see her, kind of standing up for the first time, which she might have been at daycare for that if it weren't for this. So there's definitely some things to be thankful about. And she has no idea what's going on, and I think a lot of younger children aren't really sure what's happening either. And I think that there's a lot that as parents we can learn from them. We can learn that positivity, that hope for the future that children have. And I think that we can kind of try to internalize that and realize that we are also the curators of their world. So if we're always anxious and stressed out and watching every press conference and every, news update and just like talking negatively, that's going to really shift their perception of the way things are. But if we keep the house, a fun place, if we have our daily activities and, spend a lot of quality time together, I think that children could look back on this as being actually, a positive experience when they're spending more time with their family and not something scary because, they don't need to be exposed to that if we can kind of protect them from that to the extent possible.
Your husband, John, also works as an emergency manager for the city of Los Angeles. So what is it like when both parents are working in first responder type jobs and have to work long shifts, like 12-hour shifts in the EOC, or they have to deploy on short notice or be on call?
It's really hard. So we're pretty new at this. Like I said, my daughter's turning 9 months and I just started coming back to work in February. So it really hasn't been that long yet. So this has really kind of been our first challenge with that sort of situation. And fortunately, it is a situation where I have, and he has been able to work remotely some as well, which has been really, really good because I don't know really how we would manage this otherwise if it was something where we both just had to go in. I mean, we do have some family nearby, but it's definitely a challenge, but it is I mean, I love having a husband that works in the same field because I think we can bounce ideas off of each other all the time. And sometimes we're even supposed to be on some of the same conference calls right now because I'm working with the LA County, which is kind of funny. But we try to balance things, between the two of us as much as possible and the different obligations we have. Fortunately, we're both working with good bosses right now who have been flexible with us and to the extent we can allowed us to still fulfill our responsibilities and understanding our situation with the childcare. So, I think we're in the same boat as other people, maybe not as emergency managers, but I know, other couples that are essential workers as well. And it's a challenge right now with so many daycares closed, but, we just try to be there for each other as much as we can and try to see kind of the bright side in that at least we get to spend, more time together and with our daughter when we can, where we can, and we can kind of swap back and forth.
Well, Jenny, thank you so much for being on today's episode. I have so much admiration for you. I remember when I first started out in emergency management and I was still at UCLA working for their Office of Emergency Management, and I had heard about some incredible initiatives that you were leading at CSUN at the time, and I was on my way to meeting you for the first time. I remember just, having that crush feeling. So it's just been super wonderful to have you as a colleague and as a friend over the last few years and to get to learn from you and everything that you do and the writing that you're doing. It's always incredibly insightful.
Well, thank you so much because you're really inspiring me a lot with this podcast. I have listened to all of the episodes and I'm so excited that you took the initiative to do something like this, something creative where you're really telling stories and allowing people to share their experiences, because I think that's one of the most important things we can do at a time like this is, share our experiences and share our emotions. And this is a really great podcast and initiative. So thank you so much for asking me to be a part of it.
I'd like to close off this episode by thanking Jenny and all other fearless emergency managers out there who with passion and dedication help us navigate through disasters. As I just mentioned, I am an absolute fan of everything that Jenny does for our field, and I highly recommend you checking out some of her insightful writings at jennynovak.com. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I love being able to highlight positive actions like Jenny's coming out of this pandemic. To help me reach even more listeners, feel free to leave a rating or review of the podcast in your app or subscribe to the show. Thank you, and until next time, I'm your host, Lorraine Schneider.